Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, Complex Humanitarian Emergencies, where crisis, conflict, climate, and COVID-19 meet. My name is Patty McElreevy, and I'm the President and CEO at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. This webinar is co-sponsored by Alliance Magazine, Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, Network of Engaged International Donors, and Philanthropy New York. We thank them for their support. Some reminders before we get started. We are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. While you can access Zoom created captions today, you will have more accurate captions in the recording. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box, and we will answer them at the end of the panel presentation. If you're on Twitter, please use hashtag CDP4Recovery, that's CDP, the number 4 recovery, to share and join the discussion. And at the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings to better meet your needs. As we begin the webinar, CDP acknowledges that we are working from the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural disaster of colonialism, as well as disasters. We acknowledge when the US was founded, there were exclusions and erasures of Indigenous knowledge about how to appropriately care for these lands, causing environmental destruction and degradation, which has had a significant impact on disaster risk and on communities. We are committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy. We commit ourselves to understand where and how wealth accumulation has harmed people and the earth itself, and the complexities of philanthropy as connected to that truth. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us and acknowledge the original peoples and their elders, past and present, as well as future generations. A complex humanitarian emergency, a CHE, is a type of disaster event or a sequence of events that is caused by and results in a complicated set of social, health, economic, and often political circumstances, usually leading to great human suffering and death, and requiring external assistance and aid. The name of this webinar is pulled from the various factors associated with CHEs, such as war, conflict, underdevelopment, poverty, overpopulation, human-caused environmental destruction, and climate change, and disaster events such as drought, famine, and floods. The United Nations considers a CHE to be a crisis involving multiple causes. CHEs require a broad and integrated response, often with immediate humanitarian and long-term development, political, peacekeeping, and peace-building efforts. These usually occur in geographies where the world's most at-risk populations live, involve multiple compounded threats, increased vulnerabilities, and the threat of further disasters is high. Now it is my honor to introduce our special guest. I am looking forward to the information they'll share with us. Alex Gray is my colleague here at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. He's our Director of International Recovery Funds. With more than 16 years of experience in international humanitarian policy and practice, Alex brings a unique blend of operational and strategic expertise to disaster philanthropy. Throughout his career, he has focused on fostering greater collaboration across all stakeholders and has spent much of his time innovating and pioneering new approaches and initiatives aimed at fostering new partnerships and improving the efficiency and effectiveness of the aid sector. Since 2013, Dominic McSorley has been the Chief Executive Officer of Concern Worldwide, Ireland's largest international humanitarian and development organization that operates in 24 of the world's poorest countries. Dominic studied law at Queen's University Belfast before joining Concern in 1982 as part of their extensive refugee operation on the Thai-Cambodian border. Over the next 3 decades, he went on to lead Concern's responses to some of the world's most devastating humanitarian emergencies, including Rwanda, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Darfur, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, and Iraq. Lars Peter Nielsen has been director of ACAP since 2009. Experience in response to both sudden onset disasters and more protracted crises. He has for the past 20 years worked in numerous crises across the world, including Myanmar, Pakistan, El Salvador, Turkey, Uganda, Angola, Mozambique, DPRK, Afghanistan, and Zimbabwe. He has conducted a range of reviews and analyses of humanitarian programs for NGOs, the Red Cross, Red Crescent Movement, and the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking your time to share your expertise with us. Alex, let's start with you. Why is CDP increasing its focus on CHEs, and what does that look like?
Sure, thanks, Patty. Yeah, so So some of you may know that CDP produces the Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy report. And so in 2018, that report showed that only 2.27% of grants that went towards complex humanitarian emergencies, while about 43% went towards natural disasters and 54% went towards disasters more broadly. In that same year, Mercy Corps reported that around 80% of international humanitarian assistance goes to people in conflict-affected contexts. And that latter split is actually more representative of where humanitarian needs are. So philanthropy currently isn't allocating disaster funds proportional to where the needs exist. And we hope to be able to change that. If we move on to the next slide. Yes, so in 2020, before, oh, sorry, the next slide. Yes, I can see that. All right. So under our educate and inform pillar, this is the why of why CDP is doing this. Under the educate and inform pillar, we want to draw attention and inform our stakeholders and our broader audience on where the greatest humanitarian needs are. And that will include some of the world's biggest and most well-known humanitarian crises, such as Afghanistan. But we also want to draw attention to the often equally devastating but forgotten crises that don't make the media headlines, such as the Cameroon and the protracted ones such as Sudan and Somalia. In 2016, a report by ODI found that 58% of disaster deaths reported were actually in the top 30 fragile and conflict-affected states. So, investing smartly in these contexts arguably has greater impact depending on how you want to measure it. Through our strategic grant making, it's another way we tackle this. We hope to demonstrate to the philanthropic community and other stakeholders that disaster and emergency preparedness, response, and longer-term recovery work can take place and can be very effective and impactful in these complex humanitarian emergencies. So how do we do this? Well, we have a global recovery fund, which I call our signature fund. We know that every year humanitarian needs in terms of funding required are not fully met. We also know that about 80 to 90% of humanitarian funding goes to the same countries year after year. And despite the progress that has been made since the World Humanitarian Summit in terms of longer term, more sustainable solutions, we still have a long way to go. For our COVID-19 recovery fund, we prioritized and focused on complex settings. And the reason we got to this solution was, or this decision rather, in terms of priorities was, we used a combination of indicators in our analysis. One was the ACAPS Severity Index, which my fellow panelist, Lars, is going to talk about in a moment. The other is the Fragile States Index. We looked at healthcare system rankings around the world, and we also looked at vaccination rates. And then finally, we mapped that to the Global Hunger Index, which is also a good indicator of poverty levels and existing systemic vulnerability. And when we analyzed all of these indices together, we generally found that the same countries appeared on all the lists. And the last two things I would say is, how else are we doing it? Well, we want to generate evidence and communicate the impact of projects that we fund in complex humanitarian emergencies to try and influence others to do so. And the last is that, we want to continue to provide additional information and resources on complex humanitarian emergencies and share those as broadly as we can.
That's great, Alex. I mean, there's a follow-on question related to where that funding goes, but I think I'm going to save that for later because it may be touched on as well by the other panelists. Lars Peter, one of the tools that Alex mentioned that we utilize at CDP is the ACAPS Severity Index. How does ACAPS create its severity index and its risk assessments?
Thank you. Yeah, I think maybe the first thing I would like to say is that in ACAPS, all we do is make sense out of crisis. We are specialized in providing analysis of humanitarian crisis, and we do so to enable humanitarian decision makers to make better decisions, more evidence-based decisions. We sometimes say that what we do is try to shape the humanitarian narrative. And that is quite a difficult task, actually, if you think about it. The information space and decision-making situation that we deal with in humanitarian crisis is characterized by a lot of uncertainty. So there's a lot of things we don't know. Often we deal with high levels of ambiguity, so we don't really understand the nature of the problem always. There's time pressure to make decisions really quickly, often. And we are dealing with a large set of actors that are not always very closely linked to each other. And so when we work, our point of departure is that analysis of the situation that we're operating within great levels of insecurity uncertainty and ambiguity with a short time frame and a large group of decision makers. So the way we do that, I have tried to illustrate on this slide here. The funnel represents all the sort of data we have. So we take everything from a tweet to a report from the World Bank or ICG or whoever it may be, and analyze that, break that down with a human-led approach to analysis. There's a little brain there at the bottom of the funnel, as you can see. And I think that's an important point to make, because there's a lot of talk about more sophisticated machine learning, big data methods these days. And our experience is that because of the ambiguity and the uncertainty that I mentioned before, really what works best is to have real humans look at these crises and formulate a clear narrative on that basis. We produce a lot of products, but you can basically break them down into two different kinds of products. On the right side of the slide, you will see a spreadsheet with a whole bunch of numbers on it and a map illustrating the severity index that Patty mentioned. And what we do there is every month we produce a number between 1 and 5 for each crisis we scan, and we scan around 120 crises across the world. And so what we try to do is basically make very, very different phenomena, anything from Venezuela to Burundi, comparable, by saying how severe is this crisis, how big and how bad is this crisis. And so the purpose of this is to enable decision makers such as yourself to set priorities at a global level on some kind of comparable basis. So you'll be able to see how severe is the crisis. As we've said earlier, around 80% of humanitarian needs are in complex emergencies, but that's a lot of countries. How do you prioritize between them? So that's what the index does for you. And on the other side, on the left side of the slide, you'll see a more normal report, sort of a narrative report, in this case about Ukraine. And I'm sure most of you have followed Ukraine the past couple of weeks, and just like we have really struggled to figure out what's exactly the situation, what kind of humanitarian needs are being generated here. But we try to highlight that through narrative reports describing how people have been affected, where they are, and what types of needs they have. Thank you.
No, that's great. I mean, it is really making sense out of an enormous amount of data and putting it into a form that people can move forward on, and incredibly valuable. Dominic, Concern also develops a list. How does Concern Worldwide make its list and ranking?
Thanks, Patty. And actually, just to say, look, thank you for organizing this. You know, CDP is a very smart, responsive, necessary agent in this time of really global crisis. And just a note of appreciation. I know, you know, whether it was Cyclone Idai supporting our work, or in the COVID response in Kenya, it really made the timely and phenomenal difference. I guess just I wanted to start by saying, next slide is for Concern, I suppose, and it's important, not where we focus, but maybe why. And very briefly, you know, we came out as a response to the Biafra famine, the world's first televised famine, which had a visceral reaction across the nation of Ireland, a country itself that had undergone conflict, overcoming poverty, famine, and colonization, not that long ago in our history. And I think that has resonated and continues to resonate, and it's really put the focus on where we respond today. And I think those elements of the complexity, poverty, hunger, and oppression have really been central in determining where we work. Next, the next slide just really shows, I mean, Lars just pointed out, ACAPS is a wonderful tool, and there are many, many great tools to kind of define that we draw on. But I've got to tell you, like, ranking humanitarian crisis is actually quite a tricky business. And I think, the danger is what's in the top 10, which ones are you excluding? And certainly today, what we know is the numbers of countries going through that and the severity of that is only multiplying. I guess for concern, we use a number of tools, and Lars has mentioned one of them, and also the European Commission for Joint Research Centre. The UN, Global Humanitarian Appeal, and lots of information in relation into ranking that. One that I wanted to mention that we've been working on 16 years now, collecting data on global hunger. I'm working with a partner of ours, Weltunke Hilfe, German Agro Action, and this really tracks levels of hunger at a global, regional, and a national level, and actually does comparisons. And you'll see then it really uses 4 sets of criteria around wasting, undernutrition, stunting, and morbidity. And there are some countries that don't have all of that data, but on the ground assessment tools provide that. And I think that's certainly key to defining the kind of countries that we are working in. But what's critically important, I think, even within those countries, is having an on-the-ground presence and engaging with civil society, local community groups, civil society actors as the agents for collecting and analysing data. And that puts the 24 countries that concern fragile and conflict affected, and the 7 or 8 that we had on the top of the list that Patty, you would have seen on our website.
Thank you, Dominic. It's just been asked if we can all take a bit slower in our pace. So just a reminder to the panelists to take a moment. Alex, I'm going to come back to you, and I'm going to ask you to start off with us with first answering a question that was asked already, related to 80 to 90% of the funding goes to the same countries. If you could just maybe speak a little bit about that. And then if you can follow up with why should other funders follow CDP's example, and what resources do you have to help them? Or do we have to help them? Sorry.
Thank you, Patty. Sure. So the first, yes. So apologies if I'm talking too fast. It's what Scottish people do, and the accent probably doesn't help. We know that 80 to 90% of funding goes to the same countries, and those are, I can give examples, but like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, although that's kind of like taken over, and I hope to talk about Afghanistan separately in later. But Yemen, consistently was considered, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, or the biggest in the world. Sudan and South Sudan and Somalia, these countries are, typical of the ones that consistently have protracted needs, and will have significant appeals, UN appeal figures in terms of the requirements needed every year. So you can get access to that information, and I'll put a link for people to have a look at that later to see. But the Global Humanitarian Assistance Report every year kind of tracks that and looks at trends, and it will tell you which countries are receiving the most. The second part of the question is, well, I think I answered a lot of it in my last slide, which is, like why CDP is doing it. And I think the more that philanthropy, and we're not the only ones working in protracted crisis. There are in complex emergencies, there are other philanthropists that do it. But I think the more that we can amplify and show that you can have an impact, and you do tell the story about how you can tackle multiple vulnerabilities or address inequities, you know, with people who often face multiple different forms of marginalization and risks within the communities that they live. You know, much like you know, Dominic was talking about earlier, then your dollars can go a lot further. For us, we do it through our funds, like I spoke about before. And in terms of information that we have a wealth of information on our website. You know, we have a list is here, but you know, and within each of these, you know, whether it's refugees or some of the issues that you face in a complex humanitarian emergency, that's a separate document, and there's a link to that in this complex humanitarian emergencies issue insight that we have online. It will also give you links to some of the policies that are required in complex humanitarian emergencies, and some of the ways that intersectional inequities can be addressed when you're responding in these locations as well. So we're going to continue to, there is a wealth of, and I would encourage you to go on our website. We provide links to other websites that has more detail on some of these issues. And then we're going to continue to work on prioritizing that in 2022 and beyond.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And Lars Peter, how can funders use the resources such as ACAP's data for themselves to guide their funding?
Yeah, so I think it's important to say both what you can do and what you cannot do with our data. I think one of the most important things you can do is to help compare crises and decide where to support. That, of course, is driven by how severe the crisis, how big the needs are in different contexts, but of course also by other factors such as how much funding is already going into this crisis, how good is humanitarian access, are we actually able to work in there, and there I think our product can help you understand globally what the situation is, what's the global humanitarian narrative, if you want, and then have a smarter conversation about where to then invest, so to speak. I think what characterizes ACAP's work is that we don't have a operational role. All we do is analysis. So we don't have a systematic bias towards the places where we already work. So the geographical bias or a specific sector or target population doesn't mean we get everything right, but it means that we're not systematically skewed towards one side or another in what we do. So I think we do provide a fairly good and even evidence base to help decide on the choice between countries. And I think once that choice then has been made, then the more narrative works we do can help create an understanding of what are the priorities in that country. And I think that breaks down essentially to three different things. It is where in the country is the crisis the worst, so geographical concentration, is it the northwest or in the south of the country? Who is actually in need? What is the characteristic of the different population groups affected by crisis? And then finally, what kind of needs do they have? Is it a wash crisis? Is it a food crisis? Is it a protection crisis? What's the nature of the need? So one, help prioritize between different crises. Two, help prioritize within a crisis in terms of what type of support to provide. And then I think it helps also because we do a forward-looking sort of risk monitoring, a horizon scanning of 6 to 9 months. So it helps you also understand what may be coming next. It helps stretch mindset and think about possible futures for where crises may deteriorate in the coming months. And we choose that time frame 6 to 9 months because we think we can do that fairly well. I think if we move beyond those 6 to 9 months, it's very difficult to actually say something sensible about what will happen next. So for me, those are the three main things that our products can help you do. And what it cannot do is it can't tell you who to support, that we don't analyze different organizations individually. We look at the crisis context as such. We also don't look at, we look at the nature of the needs, not the interventions. So we would look at a crisis and say, okay, this is it a crisis of availability of food or access to food? But we don't go into the details of saying, should you do cash programming or voucher programming, or so it doesn't really help you much in terms of the specific organizations to support or evaluating how well they work. We just don't go into that area. And we also actually don't cover information around funding, but there are other sources on the market where you can find that information. So I think that's what we are and are not. Thank you.
And I think that's such a critical reminder, especially for the donors on this call, to understand, the differences between the quantitative data, the qualitative data, and how best to use data, and that it's not necessarily the solution for all things. And so I think, Lars Peter, it's a really great way to frame it out, what it can do for you and what it cannot do for you, because I think that also then translates to at the operational level as well, what that data will do in the similar sense. Dominic, what do you see as the most significant support on the ground in the communities with whom Concern works in complex humanitarian emergencies? And how might your ask to a funder in those situations, complex humanitarian emergencies, be different than in a natural hazard disaster?
Thanks, Patty. I mean, I guess just at the outset, I guess I would say is that the level of crisis in a country does not, unfortunately, determine and the level of need, how much funding and support a country gets. If you just look at the UN appeal last year of 36 billion, and we know that generally these appeals are probably at best 50% funded. And you look at countries as Chad, Niger, Burundi, or Haiti last year, they got about 20% of the appeal that they needed. I was in Central African Republic not that long ago. I said to the UN rep, I said, what do you do when you only get 20% of what you need? And he said, you start cutting everything. And that means things like additional food, meals. He said they get cut from twice a day down to once a day, he said, and things like protection, gender-based violence, education, they tend to be very poorly funded when budgets are cut. And what we know is those budgets, when they're cut, push people into negative coping mechanisms. So I think it's really important, that the levels of need are met. And this is where outside, of the traditional big donors, this is where this funding is so important. I think in some respects, natural disasters and complex emergencies, what's standard is, there should be quality accountable programming regardless of either of those contexts. But certainly in the conflict ones, they tend to be very protracted. Security becomes a major issue. Impartiality, ensuring that you're not being seen to work with different sides, is really a top priority. And having an active presence on the ground so that you're not just deciding on a plan, but you're changing the plan and you're moving as the situation changes. So I just say what is required, flexible, predictable funding that's really targeted where the needs are greatest. I've seen through Irish Aid and other donors where they've come in and they've given us 4 or 5 year funding. My God, that changes the conversation that you have when you're going into communities to say, let's not worry about the funding because we have funding. Let's now start talking about how we can work with you. It changes everything. And that's really important. And targeted where it's needed is greatest. I think secondly, what do affected populations have a right to? Not just what do they expect, what do they have a right to? And they have a right to inclusive, appropriate approaches. How you do what you do is as important as what you do. Efficient, effective, timely, coordinated, complementary, built-in complaints mechanisms. And Patty, I know these are standards that you in your entire career have been pushing and holding up for organizations to meet even in the most challenging. And I think it's all very well to say we do these, but I know there are systems where part of this core humanitarian standards where our work gets independently audited around 9 standards to ensure that we're meeting those. So I think it's important for the donors, for the communities to have that expectation And second, just the last one, I think what's really important is to try and, next slide, is to try and demonstrate through evidence and impact of what's happening. What change did you bring? And I'm just using one example. We've been working in climate smart agriculture predominantly with female-headed households, women farmers. They are the ones who do most of the labor. And this is conservation agriculture that does three things. It increases productivity, it is good for the environment and sustainability, and it reduces labor. And if you look at kind of tracking of these in terms of the difference that that's making in what we call, you know, the hunger gap, the 2 or 3 months a year or 4 months in the year when families are struggling. And you can see when you track that over in a place like Burundi, that 4 months has gone down to 2.5. But importantly, the research in Malawi showed that the labor that was saved by women who are doing 90% of it anyway, they saved 34 days a year out of 365 when they didn't have to go out and farm. And that is not a gift, that is their right. So I think it's really important, you know, for your donors to say, we want to start to see over time, you know, what kind of tangible change we're making, even in these complex contexts.
So speaking of change in complex contexts, DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is concerns. It received your highest rating. And can you tell us a little bit about what's happening there?
Sure, and you know, Patty, I think it just, you know, your title is around conflict and climate and COVID, and all of those three toxic drivers are really expanded. I mean, DRC has everything, but on the scale and the size of the population, it seems to be multiplied by 10. We've been working in there for about 27 years. It's a vast country. It's an extraordinarily rich country. It has a lot of resources, but all of these ongoing conflict, the whole legacy of colonization has really pushed this country much further back than it should be. And I think COVID is still continues to have a massive compounding problem of poverty. We did a survey with a number of other organizations of 16,000 households across 25 countries, including the DRC. What was the impact of COVID, particularly on women? And it was a year ago profound, where women who said that they were eating least and last to ensure that their husband or their children could eat, or that where their livelihoods, where they were selling things in the market, were wiped out, not just for a day, not just for a month, but almost in many cases indefinitely. So the upside of that is rising levels of acute malnutrition. 3.4 million children under 5 suffering from acute malnutrition, and that is rising every day. And now DRC, you'll see in that scale, is food insecurity is increasing massively. And I think the concern, now you're going to be talking about Ukraine, is hunger now is going to start to emerge. Conflict and hunger is evident as key drivers in DRC. And I think just next, I just want to mention just in terms of, well, what can and what is being done. And I think it's important just to understand the mechanics of the kind of an organization, any organization that does both emergency response and long-term planning. This is a constant balance, you know, because in a country, crisis country such as DRC, you're dealing with these crises while also trying to keep your eye on the prize of sustainable development. And I think it's really important to have dedicated funding for emergency response, so you're not cannibalizing and not drawing money away from long-term education, from the health. Ensure you have sufficient money so that you can respond and not pull resources, pull staff away from ongoing programs. Really important, I think, for organizations to find out where they're adding value. You know, what areas can they? There's very many organizations working in there. Not everybody needs to be doing the same thing, but you're complementing with a kind of skill set. I think critical is investment in staff. And, you know, this is where, you know, donors, you want to make sure that agencies have management courses, leadership courses, and are engaging, you know, with their staff around things, even as security training. And I think culturally, you have to go into what we call this emergency plus. If you're going in to respond to a crisis, your planning needs to be thinking beyond that into prevention and resilience. And I think the last thing is around coordination and partnerships. There are structures in there, the humanitarian country teams, there are rapid response, the private sector has a key role to play in that. And I think organizations really need to be engaged in multiple aspects at the local level, at the international level, and ensuring that whatever activities they're doing are complementary and coordinated with many, many multiple actors.
Thank you, Dominic. And so many of these are obviously, incredibly important in all contexts. And DRC is a perfect example of where, doing it wrong will actually cost even more. And thank you for the comment related to the ripple effects of the grain crisis and the cascading of what will happen, as a result of Ukraine. I don't think we all know where that will end, but another country that will be impacted beyond DRC from the grain insecurities, amongst other things, is Afghanistan. Alex, CDP has given Afghanistan our highest CHE rating. What's the situation looking like on the ground from who you've been talking to?
Sure. Thanks, Penny. I mean, unfortunately and sadly, a lot of, what Dominic was just describing is equally applicable, like you said, Patty, to Afghanistan. I mean, what's happening there? I mean, well, first, decades of conflict and protracted conflict and complex crises combined with the changing climate, the gender inequalities that exist, rapid urbanization, underemployment, and then the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as a political crisis. And I'll talk about that in a second. All of that coming together, I mean, that is incredibly complex. We've given it our highest profile emergency rating, which is a level 3, for a number of reasons. And it's, to draw attention to it. I think it got a lot of media attention, as the US and allies were kind of withdrawing. But you've not really seen Afghanistan in the news much. And yet we just saw the UN release its largest ever appeal in history for a single country, with over 5 billion requested. And that's, just to put it into context, more than the total global appeal for all countries back in 2004, which was 3.4 billion then. I mean, that's a phenomenal amount of money that's needed. And that's only for essential life-saving relief, right? That's not for the longer term, the medium term, that's not development. That's literally to feed people and keep people alive, and to stave off even greater humanitarian catastrophe. So, I think the other thing to note is that the geopolitical interest, as I was mentioning, is waning. So the humanitarian situation is deteriorating rapidly. And it's a regional crisis, and it goes beyond the region. There's many refugees in neighboring countries and further afield, including here in the USA. And it was actually great to see a lot of the domestic nonprofits responding and welcoming Afghan refugees here in the US. But remembering that most Afghan refugees are within the region and the surrounding countries. I think, drought and food insecurity is the key thing at the moment. I mean, all the things that I mentioned, all the factors are important, but, the latest figures are that 98% of people don't have enough food to eat. That was the latest figure put out by the World Food Programme. That's incredible. Over half the population as well are facing crisis levels of food insecurity, with 8.7 million facing emergency levels of food insecurity. So it's extremely worrisome. And we have to wait and see how much the international community steps up to just meet those life-saving needs. Most of the population do suffer from the negative impacts of these multiple intersectional and compounding vulnerabilities. And if you take into consideration the pre-existing levels of poverty that existed in Afghanistan, which the UN projects is going to increase to 98% of the population by the middle of this year. then populations were already vulnerable to begin with due to the underdevelopment and failed policies that have been implemented in the last 20 or so years. So it becomes hard to pinpoint like what is the root cause, because in reality it's multiple, it's all of these reasons. And that's where the complexity comes in for me. I mean, one last point I just want to highlight is that most recovery and development funding has effectively been halted by international donors who, for political reasons, don't want to fund the new government in Afghanistan. So that means that, you know, public sector workers won't get paid. You know, your teachers and your healthcare workers and your midwives and doctors, and you know, development assistance has effectively stopped, which is effectively crippling the healthcare and education systems. So for me, there is arguably an even greater case to be made for funding long-term recovery work than in other contexts. I mean, as Lara said, it's hard to say which country is deserving over another. It's you know, I do not like to be asked that question. It's a very difficult one to answer. But just, you know, one last, I guess, you know, final thing I'll say on a hopeful note is that, you know, we were mentioning before our funds. So, you know, when I went through the analysis and used all of these factors, like, you know, Dominic and Lars were talking about, you know, we used the same criteria as them. We selected Afghanistan as one of the priority countries, and you know, we're working with partners that are on the ground to implement and fund programs that are looking at strengthening the public health system there and training and capacitating female health workers, addressing food insecurity and economic recovery by looking at climate smart agriculture solutions like Dominic was talking about in DRC, you know, and looking at resilient livelihoods for women and the most at-risk populations. And some water rehabilitation projects, which is going to be really important for livelihoods, especially in a drought. Right. So there is hope. And I guess my main message is, yes, even in these worst crises, that, you know, and we all have our lists of what we say, you know, believe is the worst one at the moment, and where we should focus our attention, that it is possible to have longer term, like, sustainable impact. And it is important for actors to complement each other, like Dominic said. And the way we do that is, and the way, you know, we focus our attention is by focusing on the recovery and longer term needs.
Right. Thank you for that, Alex. And Lars, Peter, just coming back to you on, you know, CHEs by definition are complex. So the results will look different than they might in a disaster, you know, that's created from a severe weather or a natural hazard. What are some of the ways in which you've seen funding make a difference in CHEs?
Before I jump into that, maybe I would like to just speak a bit to this business of which is the worst crisis, how do we rank, and so on, because it's been brought up by the previous speakers. And I think the first thing I want to say is that it's really something that it's quite a daunting task, right? To take human suffering at this scale and boil it down to a number with one decimal point. It's a very, very strange and at times, mind-bending exercise. And I think it's important not to sort of have false precision in the way we compare these crises. I think what you can use these indices for is to broadly categorize clusters of crises. And if you think about DRC and Afghanistan, for example, obviously those are both overwhelming crises that are extremely severe and have been extremely protracted. I just say this because sometimes we get so fixated on, oh, that's a 4.3 and that's a 4.1, so I'll go for the 4.3. That it's not the way to think about it. These numbers and indices are a conversation starter. It's a way to basically guide your thinking about where to invest. It's not a GPS, right? It's not precise in that sense. It's really important that we don't go on autopilot just because we have a number. That's just a little rant of mine around these indices that sometimes can have also a negative impact, actually. I just want to, with respect to where does it make a difference, I want to reiterate that complex emergencies is where we find most of the protracted humanitarian needs. And I think it's important when we talk about investing in these crises, helping people affected by these crises, that we sort of set the bar right in terms of what success looks like. Does it make a difference, and so on? Because there's a reason why these crises are so protracted, and that is that they're extremely difficult to actually solve. The root causes are very deep, and often there's a strong conflict element in complex crises. And I think it's important to say that while the great work that Concern is doing, that all the ISC agencies, all of the NGOs, the Red Cross that we see on the ground today in Ukraine, the UN family, the great work that all of the humanitarian agencies do in helping millions of individuals every year, that's the success. It is helping people in need. We can't fix a war like the one in Ukraine with humanitarian aid. I think it's important that we as humanitarians make that point, that we're not as such a solution to the root problems of conflict. We can create an enabling environment, ensuring that there are conditions in place that makes it easier to maybe solve the crisis. But really, the reason we do what we do and the way we work is to help those individuals that have fallen through the cracks because of these incredibly difficult situations that we work in. And I chose to add a little drawing from Colombia, which is a very good example of just how protracted a crisis can be and how difficult it can actually be to solve, and how we continue to see massive risks on the horizons for that context also.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Lars Peter. I think, you captured it so well, which is, and I think it's often said in the humanitarian, by humanitarian actors, that humanitarian, actors cannot, there's no humanitarian solution for humanitarian problems, right? It's that many of these complex situations are the solutions rest with others. And I think Ukraine is an exact example of that. And I'm going to just ask each of you, we do have some Q&A, there's quite a lot that's come up, but I would like to have each of you spend, give me a quick, 1 point on what you think, what were your top thinking, top level thoughts on what folks on the call should be doing, thinking, watching in terms of this crisis. And if you can keep the answers brief, because we do have quite a lot of questions I'd like to try and get to if we could. Why don't we start with you, Dominic?
Thanks. Yeah, Ukraine is on everybody's minds. It's on every television screen. I think it is in the 3 or 4 scenarios that agencies were penning out. This is turning into be one of the worst. I just think one thing, there's a lot of discussion, as you know, about humanitarian corridors to allow people to escape. I think we need to be putting pressure on ceasefire to allow assistance to go in. Shouldn't have to be forced out of your country into a neighboring country to get access to food, shelter. We're only at the beginning. I think when we look at other crises such as Syria, they start small, they can become regional, and 11 years on, it's the anniversary this month of Syria, nobody's talking about it. And this is a country that slipped into years where children have not received education, where hunger levels unforeseen before are on the rise. So Lars is right, this will be ended politically. Pressure on the Security Council, all pressure that needs to happen, that's happened. The public support is phenomenal. I do think for us as a concern, I think the areas we're looking at, cash, and it's going to be expensive. Protection is increasingly going to be problematic. I congratulate the neighboring countries. They've been phenomenal in taking them in, but there could be many, many more people coming out. And so let's stand back and support where required, and let's get in to where the needs are greatest. Access is key. The one last thing I would just say is it shouldn't be, Ukraine really needs to be a lesson in the Afghanistans, in the Yemen, in the 13 million in the Horn of Africa that are suffering from food insecurity. It should not be about either or. it should be as well as Ukraine. Thanks.
That's an excellent point. Alex, would you like to come in on this?
I mean, sure. I mean, I think Dominic covered my key points that I was going to suggest, but maybe I'll just add like one or two onto that. You know, I was in Ukraine at the beginning of this crisis in 2014, and you know, I was in the Donbass region, and you know, even then, I remember seeing, you know, shelled out schools. You know, so kids were not able to access school even then. And, you know, when you walk down the streets, to me, what I walked away thinking, well, obviously every crisis affects children disproportionately, but, you know, the amount of older adults and on their own and disabled people that were left on their own and couldn't flee, it was heartbreaking. And these this is a way bigger scale beyond, like Dominic said, worst case scenario. So, you know, those vulnerable groups and those at-risk groups, I mean, I think we have to remember, especially given the fact that you know, men can't leave, or men under 60 can't leave the country. All of those marginalized or at-risk populations within the communities that are fleeing and that are left in Ukraine need particular focus and care. I mean, you know, it's, you know, mental health and protection, all the stuff that Dominic said is really important. But the other group I forgot to mention is, you know, LGBTQ plus population who were already marginalized and are just, you know, being are very afraid of what's going to happen, you know, going forward, given that we don't know how the scenario is going to play out with Russia. So I think, you know, focusing on the most, the needs are immense. It's going to be very hard to prioritize. I agree. It's, you know, how do you make those decisions? And that's why I think it's good that different organizations have different focus. And then also just being, you know, it's hard to not respond to the most acute needs and to try and be thinking about the long term at this stage, but just trying to keep your eyes on that in more medium term and longer term scenarios as well, I would say.
So thank you for that. I'd like to come back to, there's so many rich questions that have been sent in advance that are in the Q&A. I wish we had just another half an hour at least with all of you to get into these topics, but I think we're going to have to be a bit tough with ourselves and just choose one or two. And one question that seems to be coming out in multiple themes is, and also in your comments about how difficult it is to get funding for these areas, is how can we encourage donors to fund complex emergencies? You know, the very complexity within those emergencies, where the conditions for donor confidence are low, where there's already, you know, some concerns about bias, you know, focused attention on certain versus others, restricted humanitarian access. You know, the more serious the conditions, the more serious the impact on people's lives. What would be your advice? What would be your top tip for the donors on the call, like, or how to get the confidence to give in these crises, to give in these situations? How would you get them to go there? Apologies, Lars, why don't we start with you?
I think it's a great question, right? And I think top tip, evidence-based. I think we need to tell an honest and compelling story about these crises. We need to have a strong humanitarian narrative that really documents the situation people are in. And we do have that in some ways, but I think we have to tell that story on the basis of the situation itself, in a sense. We have to, I saw one of the questions was about Venezuela, a crisis that we picked up fairly early because of the massive needs in that country. And I think it's a good example of a an unpopular crisis in some ways. It took a long time, we felt, to really get that on the radar. And we have to tell a story based on what the situation is, how people are doing, not based on whether we can reach them or whether we like them or whatever, but on the needs. That's I keep coming back to that. So it's no coincidence that I work with ACAP, because that's sort of what we do. And I think that is such a fundamental humanitarian issue for me. Thank you.
And Dominic?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, look, I think donors have a right to ask the tough questions, and they should be doing their research. Look, I think they need to look at all aspects of the organization. There's a lot of things online in relation to accounts, in relation to transparency, in relation to strategy, in relation to how organizations are governed. These are all really important to do that level of homework. I think what you do and how you do it is really important. Who you work with, who you're partnering with. And I think also just it's just listening to organizations who are saying this isn't all going very well. We're not going to be able to spend the funding within this time. We're going to have to stretch it out because 5 other things. Unpredictability is what we spend most of our time. We have plans, but agility, flexibility is what makes it different. In the end, something, this is about navigating through complexity, working with people on the ground to find solutions. And I think if agencies are honest with the people who support them, they will appreciate that.
No, thank you. I mean, it's so critical. And I just really want to highlight that the bias issue that's come out, it's also very important for us to look at is what crises we call upon as being more important than others, and the proximity and the rest. And that's something that CDP, and I know ACAP's in concern through our evidence, we really try and be able to separate ourselves from. There was a question in there related to CDP and our mission. And I just wanted to highlight that our mission is to leverage the power of philanthropy. And so the fact that we have these funds are not actually a conflict or a rush, in terms of how we're looking at. There are multiple ways that we amplify, that we elevate our grantee partners, that we seek to ensure that everyone, the donors, are looking at these crises, are assisting in these crises, have as wide an aperture as possible. And our funds, as to why would you choose them over other ways of doing it, is merely if you aren't prepared or able to do all that research. You have someone like Alex with his incredible expertise to help you get that funding, to match it up with other donors and to make the most of it. So I didn't want to let that go, because I felt it was important to bring that forward. But we are in no way looking at making choices between ourselves, but rather we are an option amongst many. And that's all the time we have for questions today. And I just, before we wrap up, just really want to provide the audience with some thoughts from our conversation. The CHEs are complex by nature, but at the same time, how you respond to them as funders is similar to any disaster. Research the responding NGOs and partners, identify ways you can help that meet your funding priorities, and invest in creating better conditions. As the speakers have outlined, there are a number of resources in place to help you learn more about these crises. Use these existing resources to build your knowledge base, reach out for help. Look at impact. It's perhaps slower than you might see in an environmental disaster, but just because it's incremental does not mean it's invisible. Your investments make a difference. And even if it feels like it's just a drop in the bucket, because of the immense needs, remember that we have a responsibility to help create change that is needed to improve conditions for millions of people around the world through the humanitarian imperative. CDP has many resources, including several funds devoted to disaster philanthropy that can help assist you. Due to time, I'm not going to list them all, but they're there on the slide for you to see. Many available on our website at disasterphilanthropy.org. For those of you who may be planning a disaster response funding, CDP has also additional resources and information in our disaster philanthropy playbook. You can find it at disasterplaybook.org. Our next webinar, we ask you to join us for the next month's webinar. It's Data to Drive Decisions. How can research inform philanthropic giving, taking place on Thursday, April 14th at 2 p.m. Please take a moment to complete our post-webinar survey to let us know what you liked, what we can do to improve. In order to respect everyone's time, that's all we're going to have today. I want to really thank our co-sponsors and Lars Peter, Alex, and Dominic for taking the time to share their expertise and their insights with us. If you have any questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to Tanya@tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you and have a great afternoon.